He is worthy to be praised. Amen. I just want to thank the praise and worship team and Trent for bringing us to this point in the service. How many of you have been ministered to so far already? Amen. During the worship, as we were just entering into his presence, I was reminded of Moshe when he goes on top of the mountain and he's seeking direction regarding the fate of an entire nation. Israel at that point, having been disobedient, having already broken the covenant, Moshe goes to intercede on the fate of an entire nation. And the amazing thing to me is, what does Yahweh instruct Moshe? What does he say when Moshe begins to seek his face, to seek wisdom from the Almighty? We find that the first thing Yahweh begins to do is he proclaims who he is. He begins to proclaim who he is. He says that he is merciful. He is compassionate. He begins to reveal to Moshe the attributes of his character and who he is. And my goodness, isn't that what takes place every Shabbat? We come in and we may each have our own areas that we've been struggling with, battles that we've been going through, issues that we're praying and we're seeking direction about. And yet, what does he do on Shabbat? He reminds you of who he is. Because everything else is subject to change. Everything else must bow. But as his covenant people, the number one thing that he wants you to understand and for all of us to walk in this and understand is who he is. Because my goodness, if I understand who he is, then all of these separate areas that I may be struggling with or dealing with or seeking direction in my life, there's an answer, and it's all found within his character and who he is. If I'm in need of healing, my goodness, who is he? He's Yahweh Ropheka. He's Yahweh your healer. Well, there's my answer. If I'm in need of provision or finances and I'm dealing with areas that there's a lack, oh my goodness, he's Yahweh Yireh. He's Yahweh my provider. He's El Shaddai. He's the all-sufficient one. And so we find that I believe the lesson and the significance of Shabbat, not only does it do, as Trent was sharing, it's a word sent to you in due season where you're able to hear his voice and get some clear direction, but it's a weekly appointment and reminder where you're reminded of who he is. And that's the most powerful lesson. In fact, that's what the entire wilderness journey was about. It was about Israel understanding and knowing who their Elohim was. And until they learned that lesson, they stayed in the wilderness. As I begin to delve into and look at this week's Torah portion, it's actually a double Torah portion, Mattot and Masei. Mattot is translated as tribes, and it covers Numbers chapter 30, verse 2 through 34, verse 42, and Masei, translated as journeys of, covers Numbers 33, 1 through 36, 13. And if you've been following along and you look at these verses, you'll realize it closes out the book of Numbers. It closes out Bamidbar, the season in the wilderness. In fact, next week, we dive into Devarim, which is Moshe's final speech to the children of Israel, preparing them. They're about to go in and take back the land of their inheritance. It's a generation that has been raised up in the wilderness. And so unlike the previous generation who was begging for Egypt, this generation has only known the wilderness. This has been their home. How many of you feel like maybe in your life you've been through a season where you've been in the wilderness? Well, how many of you realize that in the midst of being in the wilderness, there are times that you can begin to get antsy or you begin to feel like, man, I'm ready for a change. I'm ready to get out of this wilderness. And yet when we begin to study the significance of the wilderness will prepare you for what he has in store for you. How many realize you can never access the blessings, the promises, and the inheritance that he has for his people if you don't go through the season of the wilderness? Because the wilderness is where his voice speaks. It's the Bamidbar, the land where the word is released. And we find that in these Torah portions, as Israel's wilderness journey is coming to a close, the focus begins to shift. Because he's now speaking to a generation, they've got the green light. The go-ahead is there. They're coming up to their last and final stop. And so now everything is about preparing this generation. You're about to be transitioned into the land of your inheritance. And so we find that the focus shifts because they need to understand what mentality it's going to take the land of their inheritance. And we find that as he begins to prepare this generation for the coming conquest, they are reminded of where they have been. In fact, when you look at the names, the titles of these two Torah portions, it reveals the message, the journeys of the tribes. So as he closes out the wilderness experience, what does he do? He goes back and directly reminds them, remember where you have been. 42 stops, each one providing a significant lesson and a season of preparation for what lies ahead. How many of you realize that everywhere you have been, the battles you have went through, the things that have been allowed to happen in your life, if you'll hear the voice as it's speaking to you in the midst of it, he's reminding you every situation that I've allowed you to be in, every single stopping point is to prepare you for where you're headed. And if you will remember where you've been and how he moved on your behalf in these situations, my goodness, when you enter that land of your inheritance, then you're going to be like, hey, I've got this. Why? Because I remember this spot where he provided. I remember this spot where he showed up. I remember this occasion when he showed up in a mighty and powerful way. Why will he not do it again? Amen? And so we find that it's a journey that was required and necessary to transform a nation of slaves into a nation of sons and daughters that were capable of accessing and handling their inheritance. And as we begin to look at this, it's quite interesting because you'll find everyone wants to access the blessings, right? Everyone wants their inheritance. Everyone wants to see the promises in their life, right? You'd be a fool if you didn't. Of course we want the blessings. Of course we want to see his promises in our life. But how many realize that the journey to get there will sift out those who are incapable of handling it? Look around and say, my goodness, Yahweh, thank you. I'm still here. And I'm still listening. I'm still here. That means you still have a plan and a purpose for me. That means there's still something you're preparing and guiding me. There's still a set destination in front of me. Amen? In fact, as we look at this, he lists the 42 stops. 42 is the value of the Hebrew term yabal. And it means to flow, to lead, to carry. It's the root of the term yobel, the jubilee. In fact, Mattot is also the 42nd Torah portion. How many realize that at the end of the wilderness journey, what is he doing? He's preparing them for their yovel. You're about to experience your jubilee. And yet the same letters that form this Hebrew word yabal, rearranged, it forms the Hebrew term bali. And it means wearing out or destruction. And so we find right here at the end, he's reminding them, for some, this is going to be a season of great devastation. But for others, it's their jubilee. The distinction is made in the wilderness, in the midbar, the mouth from which the debar or the word is speaking. Do you think that perhaps this is serving as another reminder, both for Israel, but as well as for you and I, that your deliverance, your breakthrough, your promises are solely dependent upon the mouth of Yahweh releasing that word, and it's not dependent on any other factors or forces or your circumstances. Israel is reminded, your Yobel will come at the mouth of Yahweh. Amen? Well, let's look at this term wilderness. Because it seems here, as we're closing out, the whole focus is, this is where you have been, Israel. In order to know where you're going, you need to understand where you've been and the whole purpose of this journey that he has taken them on for 40 years. Let's look at the word for wilderness. It's Strong's number 4057, midbar. It's translated as meaning wilderness, pasture, or mouth. It's from the root debar, Strong's number 1696, meaning to speak, to declare, to converse, command, promise, or sing. And we understand, we've looked at this word numerous times. It's literally the mouth where the promised word is speaking. But the numerical value of the phrase bamidbar, in the wilderness, it equals 248. It's the same as the Hebrew phrase Beit Selim Elohim, in the image of Elohim. And it seems to reveal the purpose of being brought here is to be transformed into the image of Elohim. My goodness, now for all of us that gladly acknowledge, yes, it feels like I've been in the wilderness. It feels as if I've been going around this mountain just like Israel. Now I can look at this situation where I've been in the wilderness differently. This entire season was to cause me to be transformed into the image of Elohim, to be Beit Selim Elohim. For 40 years, he's watching and waiting for Israel to be Beit Selim, to be in his image. We have to understand, what does it mean to be Beit Selim, to be in the image of Elohim? The word image there in Hebrew, that root Selim, it means image, likeness, but it implies not the appearance, but the function. Elohim placed within man a representation of his own function, his character, his mindset, his purpose. Your season in the wilderness is for you to be transformed into the character of Yahweh, for you to have the same mindset as Yahweh, for you to have the same purpose. Why? So that when you access these promises and these blessings, you'll understand this isn't just for you. It's not just for you to take and do what you want with it, but this is for you to take, and now you literally become the ambassador, if you will, for the Elohim. And now you'll have his mindset and his purpose in regards to what he's given you. Amen? In Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 through 27, it says, "And Elohim said, let us make man in our image, Selim, after our likeness, and let them have dominion. So Elohim created man in his own image, Selim, in the image, Selim of Elohim created he him. Male and female created he them." When you begin to break down what's taking place, this is regarding the creation of Adam. And when he says that he's made Adam in his image, in his Beit Selim, he then goes on to give a little bit more defining factors of what this image is. His image is revealed through male and female created he them, Zakar and Nekabah. And it seems he's attaching this statement here regarding them being in his image. He's revealing that both aspects, the Zakar and the Nekabah, are required for the image to be seen and reproduced or multiplied, bringing forth life. In other words, the Selim, the function, the image, is about bringing forth and producing life. Yet in order to do so, he's reminding Israel, I believe here in the wilderness, that they must understand both the concept of releasing seed, Zakar, but it's not just about the physical multiplication, but literally the spiritual aspect, releasing the seed of the word, and also the process of Nekibah, the womb, the process of wombing or nurturing that said seed until its fruition. So we find to be Beit Selim, to be in his image, is to understand the entire gestational cycle, to understand the power of releasing the word and also wombing the word in your mind, to see it brought forth and be Beit Selim in his image. But it was quite interesting to me because when you look at this in the context, when Adam is told this, Adam lives in an unfallen condition. The moment Adam speaks, he sees it released. The moment Adam releases the seed, immediately there's a manifestation. After the fall, though, Israel is sent to the wilderness because they must learn to walk in this same level of authority like Adam did. But guess what? There's now different factors regarding Israel because now they're in a fallen condition. For Adam, where time was not a factor, Israel must now learn to function in the same capacity that Adam did, but within new boundaries. Because now time becomes a factor. Now, the moment Israel speaks forth the word, even though it's going to produce in the spiritual, there's a gestational cycle before they'll ever see it manifested in the natural. And so now they have to understand they must be very careful and guarded walking in this level because they have to understand that not only am I releasing a word, but now I have to truly hone in and understand the season of it being wombed. the season that it'll take before it ever is seen and brought to fruition. Israel spends time in the wilderness to learn of the gestational cycle required regarding the promised word of Yahweh. Could it be that Israel's season in the wilderness is to teach them regarding the cycles of his promised word? Whereas mature believers, they become capable of both releasing or speaking forth the word, but also capable of nurturing and waiting on that word. How many of you realize that it's easy to speak forth the word, but then the truly difficult season comes when you have to wait on that word? Yahweh gave you a promise. It's exciting, it's encouraging, it's powerful, and then all of a sudden you realize, my goodness, it's been 40 years. He told us when we left Egypt, we were headed to the land of our inheritance, and I haven't seen it yet. Israel had to learn, wait a minute, there was a gestational cycle regarding this word. And that gestational cycle had many factors that came into play because it was waiting on them to be Beit Selim. Waiting on them to be in the image, because if they weren't in the image, then the fruit that was produced was not going to be the correct fruit. And so now we can understand, my goodness, the wilderness cycles and the wilderness seasons are important. This season was an opportunity for Israel to prove that they were mature sons and daughters capable of handling the affairs of the kingdom, while those who were still bound by a slave mentality were exposed and experienced devastation instead of their jubilee, because they weren't capable of waiting and guarding the word that they'd been given. And it's quite interesting to me because it's very apparent, we've talked about this numerous times, there was 42 stops in the wilderness. It seems to directly correspond to the 42 months of what's called megathalipsis, the Great Tribulation, the 1,260 days that Daniel prophesies concerning. Do you think perhaps now this gives a little bit different perspective regarding what's going to be taking place during that season? That season will be a Yovel, a jubilee for his sons and daughters, and devastation for those not found in his image. Because once again, it's all about a season in the wilderness. Well, let's begin to look at this Torah portion. In Numbers chapter 30, verses 1 through 2, this is the opening of Mattot, the first of the Torah portions. It says, "And Moshe spake unto the heads of the tribes concerning the children of Israel, saying, This is the thing which Yahweh hath commanded. If a man vow a vow unto Yahweh, or swear an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceedeth out of his mouth." I want you to pay attention, because this is addressed not to every individual within Israel, but Moshe is very specific with his wording. It says that he speaks unto the heads of the tribes concerning the children of Israel. Let's look at this term, the heads of the tribes. This is where we get the title, Mattot, the word tribes. It's from the root Strong's number 4294, Matei, and it's translated as meaning a staff, a branch, or a tribe. And so not only is it referring to the 12 tribes of Israel, but this same word can also literally mean the staff or the rod. And we find that metaphorically, the image of a staff represents the supply of food, strength, and authority. And we find the origin of this use derives from the image of the leader of the tribe going before the company with his staff in hand. That staff indicates he's responsible for the well-being of those that are following. He's responsible for their supply of food, for their sustenance. He's responsible to make sure that the company that's following remains strengthened, unified, together. And he also is the authority regarding the direction and the decisions that have to be made. Be careful what you choose to look towards as your staff. What's your source? What's your sustenance? What's the authority in your life? Because that's what's responsible for you. Now, when we look at the individual Hebrew letters here, though, it's quite interesting, because this word matei, tribes, staff, It's written in the Hebrew language with the letters Mem, Tate, Hey. And it begins to reveal an interesting point of focus. The letter Mem represents the womb. It has a numerical value of 40, corresponding to the 40 weeks of the gestational cycle. Also, the 40 years they've spent in the wilderness. The letter Tate. In Hebrew, it has an inverted shape to the letter. It also represents a woman who is pregnant. Just like that Mem representing a womb, the Tate also infers this letter. It looks as if it's pregnant as well. It has a numerical value of 9, corresponding to the 9 months of the gestational cycle. On the end of Matei, we have the letter He, and it means to reveal, the released breath, which creates life. And as a suffix, the letter He means to be fruitful and able to reproduce. So once again, when we look at the title of this Torah portion, Mattot, from this root word Matei, it seems the key point of using this term to address the tribes, the Matei, is because once again, the focus is on Israel understanding the gestational cycle of the promised word they've been given, which is shortly before being born or manifest, because each of the individual letters, once again, is reminding them of a gestational cycle taking place. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 9, notice that 6 and 9, it says, "And let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not." It seems that simultaneously, as he's encouraging Israel and reminding them that there's a gestational cycle to the word they've been given, and that if they'll stay the course, they'll see it produce in their life. At the same time, the Mattot, the tribes, are reminded of the responsibility they have to their own words, which are a measuring rod of whether they're functioning in his image. Are they releasing the seed of his word, and in turn, is it wombed in their mind, or is the word that's being released revealing they're in the image of another? And so the opening statement, as Moshe is speaking to this group that's preparing to go into the land, he reminds them, keep your vows, keep your word. Why? Because that word has a gestational cycle, and in the moment you may release it and think nothing of it, but remember, there's a season. And that word will produce in your life. It's quite interesting that the first reference of Matei, staff, tribe, branch, is seen in Genesis chapter 38, and it's regarding the encounter between Judah and Tamar. And if you're not familiar with this, I would encourage you to go back and read this chapter, because it's in the midst, it almost seems like the storyline stops, and then Yahweh inserts this passage regarding Judah and Tamar. And yet this is the first time we see this word, Matei. It becomes the foundational concept of what this represents. When you look at Genesis chapter 38, you'll find that Tamar requests the staff, the Matei of Judah, which is later used as proof regarding his role as the father of the children. Now, with Judah being the chosen doorway for the promised seed of the Messiah, we find without Tamar's actions to continue on the seed line, there's the potential for a break or compromise regarding the continuation of the promise. And so this Matei, this staff, becomes significant in this story plot in continuing the promise. When you begin to look closer at what takes place here between Judah and Tamar, for those not familiar, Tamar is first wed to Judah's firstborn. He's named Ur. Ur dies, leaving Tamar childless. We find that Tamar is then promised to his brother Onan, who is to go in and raise up seed for his brother. He refuses to raise up seed in his brother's stead. He is also cut off. Now, in this story plot, within this one chapter, we're now told Tamar must wait for Shelah, the youngest of Judah. In Genesis chapter 38, verse 11, we read, "Then said Judah to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow at thy father's house till Shelah, my son, be grown." And when you read this, you may think, well, what does this family drama have to do with the promise of Yahweh and what this Matei, what this staff represents? But there's some interesting things that take place in the Hebrew language that are connecting you to what it means to request the staff, to have access to the Matei. She is told while she is waiting for her promise, she's told to remain a widow in her father's house. The word widow in Hebrew, it's Strong's number 490, Manna, and it means widow, but it's from the root word alam, and it means to bind. But it can also mean to be silent, to be bound to something. She waits here in her widowhood, waiting for Shelah, the last son of Judah. Shelah's name in Hebrew, it's Strong's number 7956, and it means a petition or prayer. It's from the root word she'elah, which means a request, something that has been asked for or petitioned. The root stems all seem to relate that this name Shelah is related to being extracted from bondage and restriction, toil and turmoil. In other words, when you begin to delve beyond what's taking place on the surface, each of these names is quite significant. And what's taking place in the Hebrew, we find it's revealing that Tamar is bound, alam, to her prayer and petition regarding the promise in the waiting. And it seems to infer that it is not her words that speak. Her words are silent, and she allows the promised word to speak on her behalf regarding the promises that she's been given. And it seems it becomes an indicator that she is functioning in the same capacity of one who is Beit Selim, in the image, because it's his word that's speaking on her behalf. And we find that this promise that's been given is to be set free from any form of bondage, restriction, toil, or turmoil. And when you begin to look at this, it forms an interesting connection all the way to Galatians chapter 6 at the verse we looked at earlier, where Paul instructs those that are listening to faint not. And that if you faint not, you'll reap in due season. The word faint there, it doesn't just mean, oh my God, you were just so weary, you just passed out. You had physically exhausted everything you had, and you just passed out. The word faint in the Greek, it's Strong's number 1590, eklio, and it means to loose, to unloose, to be set free or dissolve. In other words, he's telling those that would have ears to hear, don't be set free from the promised word you were given. Don't be loosed from it. Don't allow it to be dissolved in your life, indicating that you're no longer committed or attached or bound to it. How many realize that it's in the waiting there is the danger of becoming set free or loosened from the promised word you've been given, yet we're instructed that we must stay bound to it if we're to see it come forth and reap in due season. And now when you begin to look, amen, now when you begin to look at the example of Tamar, she was given a promise. And I believe that Tamar understood beyond what those sons of Judah understood because they neglected their promise. She understood the significance of this covenant promise being continued on. And we find that in the midst of this, she's the one that's considered righteous. Why? Because she stayed bound to her prayers and her petitions regarding the promise she had been given. Amen? Israel is told the same thing upon preparing to cross the Red Sea. In Exodus chapter 14, verse 14, when they themselves are awaiting being extracted from bondage, from their turmoil, from the place of restriction, they're told, it says, Yahweh shall fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. Hold your peace is Strong's number 2790, karash, and it means to cut in, to plow, to engrave, to devise, to be silent or speechless, but it carries the idea of plowing and tilling the soil, the cycles of harvest. So we find, what is Israel told when they themselves are awaiting? They've been petitioning Yahweh, and now it seems as if they're given their answer, but they're being restricted. They're being, once again, the bondage is right on their heels. What are they told? They're reminded that every promised word has a cycle of harvest, that it will come forth in due season, and we must be diligent and watchful lest our own words release a seed that's contrary. In the waiting cycles is when the promised word is to be engraved on the tablets of our heart. Karash, to engrave, literally to be plowed into, to be cut into. You become one with that word. And we find that this is when we're transformed into his image. Amen. Yet what is expected of us in the waiting? As many have acknowledged, it seems if you've been in the season, you've been in the wilderness. And it's been a long road, a long journey, waiting on certain promises to come forth. And so we have to ask, well, what are we supposed to do in the meantime? What are we supposed to do in the waiting as we're attempting to ensure that we've been bound to this promise, that we've not neglected it, that we've not been loosed from it? Well, we find once again the example of Tamar seems to be connected here. In the midst of waiting for the promise, as the events play out, we find that she petitions for the staff, the Mattot of Judah. The Mattot represents the authority of that promise to speak on her behalf, and it is that Mattot, that promise, that becomes her sustenance and strength, even when it seems as if she's been forgotten. And as long as when she has the staff and she presents the staff, it answers the question of who the father of the children are. It brings forth the sons. We find that it becomes her sustenance and strength, and it brings forth the promise in her life. Do you think that this is the same pattern for you and I? To be considered mature sons and daughters is to be one who understands and has learned the harvest cycles of the promised word that you've been given. And in the waiting to see the fulfillment of it, we understand that that word in itself is our sustenance and our strength, and it's the authority over every situation that we may encounter. It's the Mattot. We find this foundational concept then becomes intertwined within the concept of the Mattot, the staff. It's about the continuation of a promised seed or word to see it brought to fruition. This is why the tribe leader carries the staff. They're spearheading this journey to see the promise made manifest. And everyone that's following is to follow the staff, to follow the word. And we find it's that promised seed or word that becomes the source of strength and authority on the journey. How many realize that this is how you faint not? In the midst of the waiting, you learn that the very promise you were given is not dictated to by your circumstances. It has its own harvest cycle. Yet in the waiting, you can petition for the sustenance, for the Mattot, for the staff needed to ensure that you make it to that season. Isn't that interesting? Because how many realize that in the midst of the waiting, it seems as if it can be very difficult, that you're not going to be able to make that next step. And yet he's reminding you, if you'll petition for the Mattot, if you'll petition for the staff, that staff is your strength. That staff is your source. That promise literally will be what enables you and continues carrying you on if you'll stay bound to it, because it's not going to stop. It's going to continue going and plowing the way forward. Amen? Now, looking further at Shelah, here in Genesis chapter 38, Tamar has been promised Shelah, the youngest of Judah's sons, but his name, it not only does it mean a petition or a prayer, but Shelah's name has a numerical value of 335. It's the same value as Har Sinai, Mount Sinai. Israel is brought strategically to Sinai to receive the answer to their petition. Until they see the full manifestation of it in the form of the inheritance of the promised land, they're reminded that they have access to the staff, the promised word, the Torah that's given to them at Sinai. And the Torah, that promised word, is capable of sustaining them on the journey. His word is the answer to any concern or need that may arise until they see the fullness of the promise. Now, as we continue to look at Mattot, we find that it comes from the root Strong's number 5186, Natah. And it means to stretch out, to extend, to spread, bend, or bow. But it carries the idea of inclining one's heart or mind in a certain direction, or of giving your attention to something? Could it be that a key component of Israel being considered capable of accessing the promised land is whether or not they have inclined their hearts and minds in this direction? Whether or not they have finally grasped that the promised word they were given is the final authority and their sustenance, that it's not dictated to by any other force or circumstance? In other words, their jubilee will literally require them to renew their minds. Do you think that perhaps that the purpose of your wilderness journey is to see if you are bound to the promised word you've been given as well? And to learn how to exercise the rights you've been given in regards to that very word in the waiting, to petition, Shelah, and understand that it is your sustenance and your strength, and you have the right to petition that word to be the authority in your life. You have the right to petition that word to become your strength when you are weak, and you have the right to petition that word to be your sustenance when it seems that there's a lack regarding the promises until you see the fullness of it. Amen? Now, with this as the foundation, it is interesting to note that the one topic that is addressed here at the end, here in Mattot, the closing out of the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, is regarding vows and the significance of keeping one's vows. Do you think perhaps Yahweh is highlighting an area that will determine what category we are placed in? Sons or slaves? And it has to do with how we have handled our own words that have been released. Let's look at this word vow. It says, if a man vow a vow unto Yahweh. The word vow is Strong's number 5088, nader. It means vow or a votive offering. It's from the root meaning to make a vow. The interesting thing is that it's first seen in Genesis chapter 28, verse 20, where Jacob makes a nader, a vow, at the location known as Bethel or Luz, to return safely to his father's house in peace when he's traveling to Laban. Quite interesting, because fast forward all the way to this Torah portion, Israel is waiting for the fulfillment of this vow made by Jacob. They too have been in Laban's house. The root of Laban's name means to make bricks. They've been making bricks in Egypt. They've been in Laban's house, and they're waiting now to be restored to their father's house in peace. The same thing Jacob was petitioning for, to be returned in peace. How many realize that to be returned in peace, shalom indicates that there's nothing lacking? But not only will they make it back in by the skin of their teeth, dragging, almost barely making it, just smoking in, and okay, we made it. No, but they will be returned in peace. They will be returned with nothing lacking. They will be returned complete and made whole, is what Jacob petitions. And it seems Yahweh strategically here in this Torah portion points Israel right back to where Jacob himself makes this vow, as it affects their future as well as ours. Because how many realize we too, like Jacob, like Israel in this Torah portion, have been removed from our father's house? We're in exile. We're not in the land. The tribes have been scattered, losing their identity. And we now see that we're being called back, which is why you've been in a season that feels like the wilderness. Why? Because he's bringing you back and he's leading you to your destination. Amen? And we're reminded, just as they are, of the vow made by Jacob, to be returned in shalom, to be returned in peace. Amen? Now, in Genesis chapter 28, verse 20 through 22 is where we see Jacob making this vow. And if you're familiar, once again, with Genesis 28, this is where Jacob has a divine encounter with Yahweh, and he sees the ladder. And upon this encounter, at the end of it, this is the statement that Jacob makes regarding what has just taken place. It says, and Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if Elohim will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall Yahweh be my Elohim. And this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be Elohim's house, and all of that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the 10th unto thee. We're going to begin to break this down in the Hebrew language. The first part of Jacob's vow is that if Elohim will be with me. With me in the Hebrew language, it's Strong's number 5978, imad. And it's translated as meaning with, yet you'll find that the letters that are written for imad, it's literally a cognate of Strong's number 5977, omed, which means standing place. It indicates an appointed position or function that a person is to fill. It carries with it the sense of restoration, endurance, or to be straight. It's from the root amad, to stand, to remain, to endure, to be presented, or to be established. It seems that Jacob not only requests for the presence of Elohim to be with him, but he's literally petitioning for his standing to be restored. For Yahweh to give him the endurance needed to see the restoration of his house into the appointed position and function they were created to fill. Amen? Now, it is interesting to note that the first use of this word imad is seen in Genesis chapter 3, verse 12. It says, and the man, referring to Adam, said, the woman whom thou gavest to be with me, imad, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat. It's dealing with after Adam and Isha have eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And this is the statement as Adam is explaining what has transpired. The woman that was imad, she was with me. But it's quite an interesting connection. Do you think that perhaps Jacob is petitioning not only for the restoration of his status that has been attacked by Esau, but he's pointing all the way back to the fall of Adam and Isha, petitioning for the restoration of the status that was lost by Adam. When he makes this statement, if you'll be with me, if you'll be imad, he's going all the way back. Remember when we first fell? Remember when we first became in the position we are now? Will you restore the standing that was lost then? And here Israel is posed to see a piece of this restoration as they enter the promised land, a foreshadowing of the restoration that Jacob's house will see at the end, the last generation, you and I. Now, Jacob's next petition, he says, if you'll be with me, his next part of his petition is if you will keep me in this way that I go. To be kept in the way. Once again, the wording points directly back to the Garden of Eden. Shamar derek, to be kept in the way, comes from this Hebrew phrase. It's the same terminology used to describe how the cherubim with the flaming sword keeps the way to the tree of life. It's shamar derek. When you fast forward, you'll find that Abraham later is recognized. He shamar derek. He keeps the way. And here Jacob is now petitioning, if you will keep me in the way. Once again, it seems to point towards Jacob's petition for a restoration to what was lost to Adam while in a fallen condition. Yet having just had an encounter with the sulam, the ladder, I believe Jacob is petitioning, if I am kept in this way, then I'm capable of having access to the tree of life. As long as I'm Beit Salim, as long as I'm in the image, as long as that DNA helix that I just saw transforms who I am, then now I can be Shamar direct. I can once again have access to what Adam was denied in a fallen condition. If you continue to look at this, it's quite interesting because Jacob sees the sulam, the ladder. Sulam has a numerical value of 130, and it's the same value as Sinai. Israel's encounter at Sinai is synonymous with Jacob's encounter with the ladder. It had everything to do with changing their DNA and transforming them, just like Jacob, into the image of Elohim. Israel, too, is reminded if they will stay in this way, if you will put on the image and stay in the image, Israel, then you too can see your restoration. Hence the significant reminder here of the nader, the vows, to see their jubilee. To see their inheritance, they must remain in the way to see their standing restored. And it's interesting because sulam is a play on words in the Hebrew with selim, image. It has the same two-letter root of the lamed mem. The next part of Jacob's petition is that he would have bread to eat. Well, remember at the very beginning, as we began to talk about the Mattot, the staff, the tribe, it represents the source of food. Once again, his wording seems to connect us right back to the staff, the Masei, which represents the supply of food or sustenance. Jacob, like tomorrow later, requests the Masei, the staff, representing the word to go before him and preserve him until he sees the fulfillment of the promise. And it's quite interesting because he petitions for bread to eat and for clothing. And we find that while Israel's in the wilderness, that's the two things that Yahweh provides for them. Their clothes do not wear out, their shoes don't wear out, and they are given the manna from heaven. He's keeping the vow that was made by Jacob right here. At the end of this vow, as Jacob makes this, he then sets up a stone for a pillar. And it literally becomes a monument, a reminder. Well, let's look at the word for stone. He says, "And this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be Elohim's house." Well, the word for stone here, it's Strong's number 68, Eben, translated as meaning stone, but it's from this same root stems other Hebrew words, one being Oben, and it means a potter's wheel or a birth stool or birthing stones. The same letters of Eben, stone, rearranged form Neba, and it means to prophesy. It's quite interesting because when you break apart this Hebrew word Eben, you have the Aleph meaning I will, and the Beit Nun, which forms the Hebrew word Ben for son. By Jacob's actions, he is issuing forth a prophetical declaration, a Nevah. This stone represents a birthing stool or birthing stones that will produce forth the fully restored sons of standing. And so when Jacob makes this declaration, this stone will be your house, it doesn't mean this physical rock is going to be significant, and this rock is going to be the cornerstone that we're going to build Solomon's temple off of. He literally is making a prophetical declaration that the Eben, the living stones, the sons will become your house because they are going to be produced forth. It's a prophetical declaration. He's calling forth the sons that will have their standing restored and literally become the living tabernacle of Elohim. Amen. Now here the second Torah portion title is Masei. It's Mattot and Masei. It's from the root, Strong's number 4550, Masah, and it means a pulling up of stakes, breaking camp, or a journey. But it's conjugated here in the Hebrew as Masei, and this phrase has a numerical value of 180, which connects right here to what's taking place. Because 180 is the same value as the Hebrew phrase Beni Ha-Navim, sons of the prophets. In other words, these Masei, these journeys, the entire 42 stops within the wilderness were the sons, the result, the fruit of the words prophesied previously by Jacob. They're all to bring Israel to their expected destination. This was the necessary journey to restore the standing. And now as Israel stands here, they become the Bnei HaNavaim. We are the sons of what you prophesied, Jacob. We're the sons of standing, coming, and being restored. Amen? Now, as Jacob closes out this encounter, he ends with the vow on his part. Notice that the vow, at first it has everything to do with what Yahweh's got to do. Yahweh, you got to restore me to my father's house in peace. You got to make sure I've got bread to eat and clothes to wear. And you got to bring me back. But at the very end, Jacob now transitions to what's his obligation. Do you want to be restored to your standing? Do you want to be considered a son that's able to return to be one that was prophesied and called forth, and now you access it? Jacob gives a clue. He ends with the vow on his part to tithe. to give the tenth. And as I was looking at this, it was quite interesting because I was looking at this and going this direction before I knew fully what Pastor David's teaching was going to be on. He had told me, oh, he's going to teach on the law of sowing and reaping. And so I was like, okay, well, it might connect here. But then the direction that his went, understanding the significance of the tithe, my goodness. And then in this Torah portion, we see it being pulled in. What's Jacob's vow? That I will give the tenth. I will give the tithe to you. And we have to ask the question, what is Jacob doing? Because this is the first time you see this you see the word in this form. Is he attempting to buy the favor of Yahweh? How many of you think that's even possible? It's not possible. Does Yahweh even need anything Jacob will offer, seeing as all of creation is his? Why does Jacob make this vow? As we said, Pastor David already shared last week the power of the law of sowing and reaping and the significance of the tithe, and it lays a powerful foundation for what is taking place here with Jacob. And it's funny to me because it was brought up last week. Some of the arguments that we as believers will sometimes try to come up with in order to get out of keeping our vows. We think hard on this. Well, there's no tabernacle, there's no temple. Notice that when Jacob makes this vow, there's no tabernacle, there's no temple. Well, there's no Levitical priesthood, so that does away with tithe. Oh my goodness, notice when Jacob makes his vow, there's no Levitical priesthood. Levi's not even born. It's just Jacob. He has not been married, there are no children. Israel isn't even a nation yet when Jacob makes this vow. He has not been joined to Rachel or Leah. None of the sons are born. They are not a nation. It's just Jacob. This is between Jacob and Yahweh. To keep this vow is between Jacob and Yahweh. To not keep the vow is between Jacob and Yahweh. Let's look at this word for tenth. Why does he offer the tenth? I will give the tenth unto thee. Once again, one of the other arguments we were talking about this, well, it was agricultural society. That's, we don't have that anymore, so we don't have to give the tenth. Jacob doesn't say, I'll give you the tenth of my crops. Jacob says, anything that you give me, all that you give me, I will give the tenth. This is my vow. You restore me to my standing, I will give thee a seir. Amen? Let's look at the word for tenth. What is the tithe? If you don't know, go back and listen to last week's teaching. The tenth, Strong's number 6237, asar. It means to tithe, to take the tenth. But if you break it apart, you'll understand the significance. Why does Jacob offer what he offers, and why is it so significant that we understand this vow? It's written, ayin, sheen, resh. The letter ayin means to see. If I see it, this then infers something has been made tangible and brought forth. The value of this word ayin, yod, nun, the actual title, the name of the letter, has a numerical value of 130. It's the same value as sulam, ladder, and Sinai. In other words, the ayin, to see the promise of the sulam, to see the promise given at Sinai fulfilled and come forth and be tangible. This is attached to the sheen resh root. It seems that this sheen resh root is going to give some insight regarding how you can see the promises that you've been given, that were given to Jacob when he sees this ladder, that were given to Israel standing at Sinai. How can you see it made manifest in your life? The sheen resh root forms the Hebrew word sor, Strong's number 8270. It's the word for navel, the navel or the umbilical cord. The cord that binds the infant, the fruit, to the mother, the womb. When he says, I will give the tithe, he's literally declaring that through his actions, through this vow that he's making, in order to see the promises that he's been given, to see them manifest in his life, he understands there must be a tangible way that he becomes bound to that promise, that he holds on to that promise. How many realize that Jacob goes and spends 20 years in the house of Laban? Much like his descendants spending 40 years in the wilderness, it was not going to be an immediate thing that the moment this promise was given, he sees it manifest. There's a 20-year cycle before Jacob ever makes it back. How will I make sure I'm bound and tied to this promise? Could our diligence to honor the vow of the tithe be a defining factor in how faithful we are to the promised word we've been given? It's what keeps the word bound in the wombs of our mind during the gestational cycle and season required to see this promise come forth. Without the tangible obedience and connection of us giving the tithe, it's easy to allow the word we've been given to be forgotten, neglected, becoming malnourished by our own lackadaisical attitude and lack of commitment. And that can be really stomping on some toes, can it? That can be painful. My goodness, have I not been committed to the promised word you've given me? Have I been lackadaisical in my commitment and allowed it to be malnourished? And that's why we're still going around this mountain? This was the vow that Jacob made. He understood the significance of the tithe, the asar. This is what's going to cause me to be bound to that promise. And as I begin to sow into this, not only am I showing my diligence that I'm bound to this promise, but it's going to continue to bring nourishment and health to both my body and to that promise. It's also no accident that the tithe, the asar, is written with the same letters that form the Hebrew word sha'ar, the gateway. Strong's number 8179. Your tithe is capable of opening spiritual gateways that allow the promised word you've been given to cross from the spirit and be made manifest in the natural. My goodness. And when you realize this, that regardless of what I do with this asar, regardless of what I do with the tenth that I'm given, of all that I'm given, the same principle applies. It can open gateways. So I can choose to do like Jacob and plant it into the promised ground to ensure that I'm attached to the promised word you've given me, and it can open the gateway for that promised word to be seen in my life, or I can plant it somewhere else. And it can open gateways just as surely for things to be manifested in my life that now I have no authority over, because it was a principle that's been laid out in the Torah, and it has every right to come into my life because that's the gateway I chose to open. Wow. Jacob understood very clearly the vow he was making. He understood to see his house restored, to see the promises revealed within the Sulam, he would need to bind himself to it and not be weary in the process. And because of that, he vows his tithe. Because how many realize that wherever you spend your time and wherever you spend your money becomes a clear indicator of what's important to you? And so he understands, if the promise is going to be important to me, if I'm going to make sure that it's top, and that this is what my vision and my goal is kept on, then both my time and my resources must be directed toward the promise you've given me. Amen? This generation today, much like the Israel of this Torah portion, is awaiting the end of our exile and the restoration of our inheritance. Yet the wilderness season we have been walking through has been designed to teach us commitment to the promised word, to give us insight regarding the times and the seasons that we walk in, to understand the harvest cycles of when we've been given a word. There's a jubilee imminently upon us, and gateways are about to be opened that will bring forth restoration for some and devastation for others. May we, like Jacob, be seen as one who has honored our vows, and therefore see the restoration of our house and our standing. How many of us that are listening right now are willing to honor the vow that Jacob made? And how many realize that the more we begin to look at this, and having been a believer my entire life and having been raised to understand that when you get to give the tithe unto Yahweh, last week's teaching and this week's has completely transformed my view of what this means, of the significance of this. And if you're hearing this type of message, I believe it's because Yahweh's trying to give you some insight and discernment, because he has plans for you. And he's trying to get his people to understand, do you want to see it come forth? Do you want to see it be fruitful and manifest? Here are some key indicators that we have to walk in understanding regarding. It's not between you and the pastor. It's not between you and whatever ministry you think that you're supporting. It's not between you, and it's not dictated to by your circumstances or your job. It's a vow between you and Yahweh. Your jubilee waits upon the word to be released from his mouth. May we hear the sound of the Yobel in our lives as we're transformed into the Eben that Jacob prophesied concerning. May we be the sons and the daughters of that prophecy, able to stand up this day and declare, Haneni, here we are. We've been bound to the promise. The gateways are now being opened, and may it be manifested in our life. Amen. Shabbat shalom.